Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into a fascinating yet controversial topic, the most successful coups in African history. Let's get started. Now, I know what you're thinking, Gerald. Coups, that sounds a bit dramatic. And you'd be right. It's like that moment in a movie when the music suddenly changes and you just know someone's about to flip the whole script. Except in these cases, the script is a country's constitution and the flipping is done with tanks and generals who've decided their PowerPoint presentations on why I should be in charge are just too compelling to ignore. We're going to journey through moments where power didn't just shift. It was more like it got thrown out a window and caught by someone waiting below with a very specific 5-year plan, or sometimes no plan at all, just vibes. We'll look at how these dramatic takeovers reshaped nations, for better or quite often for, well, that escalated quickly. It's a story of ambition, ideology, and sometimes just a group of guys who were really tired of the current management. Think of it as the ultimate high-stakes under new management sign, but instead of a new coffee machine in the break room, you get a whole new political system. So grab your metaphorical popcorn, or if you're from my neck of the woods, maybe some biltong, because we're about to explore some of the most pivotal and often turbulent boardroom takeovers in African history, except the boardroom is a nation, and the hostile takeover involves a lot more than just strongly worded emails. We're talking about events that sent ripples across the continent and the world, changing the lives of millions. We'll unpack the why, the how, and the what happened next for some of these monumental power grabs. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be an informative ride. All right, let's kick things off in Egypt, 1952. Picture this. King Farouk is living his best life, palaces, parties, probably a solid gold PlayStation, who knows? Meanwhile, the rest of the country is looking around thinking, something's not quite right here. You had British influence still lingering, like that one guest who overstays their welcome after a party, widespread poverty, and a general feeling that the rich were getting richer while everyone else was just, getting. This wasn't just a minor grumble. It was a full-blown national sigh of exasperation. Enter the Free Officers movement. Now, these weren't your average book club. This was a group of ambitious, nationalistic military officers, led by a chap named Mohammed Naguib, who became the face of the operation, and another, younger, very determined fellow named Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was basically the brains and the muscle, and probably the guy who made sure everyone's revolutionary berets were on straight. They looked at the situation, the corruption, the inequality, the disastrous 1948 Arab-Israeli war, which left a bitter taste in the military's mouth, and decided, you know what, we can do better, or at least differently. Their plan wasn't hatched overnight over a casual game of chess. This was serious business, whispered in barracks and planned in secret meetings. They were tired of the monarchy, which many saw as a puppet of foreign powers and completely out of touch with the Egyptian people. King Farouk, bless his cotton socks, was more famous for his extravagant lifestyle and his collection of, well, everything, than for his astute political leadership. It's like your CEO spending all the company money on a private jet while the office printer hasn't worked since 2003. Eventually someone's going to stage an intervention. So, on July 23rd, 1952, the Free Officers made their move. It was surprisingly swift, almost like they'd sent an email saying, "We're taking over, FYI," and everyone just sort of went with it. Tanks rolled into Cairo, key government buildings were seized, and before King Farouk could even finish his morning croissant, he was basically packing his bags. It was less of a bloody battle and more of an, okay, new management is here, please form an orderly queue to pledge allegiance, or at least don't make a fuss. The public reaction was largely supportive, or at least relieved. King Farouk was politely but firmly asked to abdicate and sail off into the sunset, which he did reportedly with a ship full of his possessions. You've got to admire the commitment to material goods even in exile. With the king gone, the Free Officers under Naguib as the first president and Nasser waiting in the wings declared Egypt a republic. This wasn't just a change of leadership, it was a fundamental shift in the country's identity. They promised land reform, an end to feudalism, and a new era of Egyptian sovereignty. It was a big reset button. The immediate aftermath was a period of immense change. The old aristocratic order was dismantled. Land was redistributed, which was a huge deal for the millions of peasants who had worked land they could never own. It was like suddenly everyone in the Monopoly game got a get-out-of-jail-free card and a few extra properties. The free officers, particularly Nasser, who soon sidelined Naguib to become the undisputed leader, had a vision of a strong, independent Egypt, a leader in the Arab world. This coup set a precedent not just for Egypt but for other movements across Africa and the Middle East. It showed that a determined group within the military could, under the right circumstances, topple an entrenched regime. The promises were grand social justice, national dignity, economic progress. Of course, delivering on those promises is always the tricky part, isn't it? It's like promising everyone a pony. Sounds great in theory, but the logistics are a nightmare. The Free Officers movement wasn't just about a power grab, it tapped into a deep well of popular discontent and nationalist aspiration. They spoke a language that resonated with ordinary Egyptians who felt left behind by the monarchy and exploited by foreign interests. This was their enough is enough moment, writ large on the national stage with military precision. The world watched, wondering what this new Egypt, forged in a swift and relatively bloodless revolution, would become. And so began a new chapter for Egypt, one that would see the rise of Pan-Arabism, the nationalization of the Suez Canal, and a leader in Nasser who would become an icon for millions. But it all started with that moment in 1952, when a group of officers decided that the status quo was no longer acceptable, and they had the means and the will to change it. It was a gamble, a bold stroke, and it fundamentally altered the course of Egyptian and indeed regional history. The long-term impact is, of course, complex. Republics born from coup have their own set of challenges, often involving a delicate dance between military influence and civilian governance. But for Egypt in 1952, it felt like a new dawn. The air was thick with possibility, and the Free Officers were the architects of this new, uncertain but hopeful future. They had successfully pressed the eject button on the monarchy and were now in the pilot's seat. Fast forward to 1969, we're heading over to Libya. Now, Libya at this time was a monarchy ruled by King Idris I. He was an older gentleman seen by some as a bit too cozy with Western powers, especially after the discovery of oil, and oh boy was there oil. Suddenly, Libya went from being a relatively quiet desert kingdom to a place with a very, very valuable resource bubbling beneath the sand. It's like finding out your backyard has a diamond mine. Things are going to change. And change they did, dramatically, on September 1st, 1969. While King Idris was abroad in Turkey and Greece for medical treatment, probably getting a checkup, maybe enjoying some baklava, a group of young, ambitious army officers decided it was the perfect time for a little redecoration of the government. Leading this group was a charismatic and then largely unknown 27-year-old captain named Muammar Gaddafi. Yes, that Gaddafi. Before the interesting fashion choices and the long speeches, he was a young revolutionary. These officers, calling themselves the Free Unionist Officers Movement, sensing a theme here with the free part, were inspired by Nasser in Egypt and the broader wave of Arab nationalism sweeping the region. They felt King Idris's regime was corrupt, inefficient, and not doing enough to assert Libyan sovereignty or use the newfound oil wealth for the benefit of all Libyans. It's the classic the guy at the top is hoarding all the good snacks argument, but on a national scale, and the snacks are oil revenues. The coup itself was pretty textbook swift, coordinated, and relatively bloodless. They seized key government buildings, airports, and radio stations in Tripoli and Benghazi. Gaddafi, with his flair for the dramatic, announced the overthrow of the monarchy over the radio, declaring the birth of the Libyan Arab Republic. Imagine waking up, turning on the radio, expecting some music, and instead you hear a young army captain telling you the king's out and there's a new sheriff in town. It's quite the morning surprise. King Idris, upon hearing the news, reportedly dismissed it initially, saying something along the lines of, "It's just a bunch of kids." Well, those kids had just taken over his kingdom. It's a bit like underestimating the intern, who then stages a brilliant corporate takeover. The coup plotters had been meticulous, operating in small secret cells, making it hard for the existing security apparatus to detect them. They struck when the king was vulnerable, out of the country and unable to rally loyal forces quickly. The new regime, under the Revolutionary Command Council, RCC, chaired by Gaddafi, immediately set about reshaping Libya. They promised to end corruption, promote Arab unity, a big theme for Gaddafi throughout his life, and ensure that Libya's oil wealth served the Libyan people. Foreign military bases, like the American Wheelus Air Base, were soon on their way out. Gaddafi was sending a clear message. Libya was for Libyans, and the old ways of doing things were over. Initially, many Libyans, especially the younger generation and those who felt marginalized under the monarchy, welcomed the change. There was a sense of excitement, a feeling that Libya was finally taking control of its own destiny. Gaddafi, with his fiery rhetoric and promises of a brighter future, tapped into this sentiment. He was the young, dynamic leader who was going to shake things up, unlike the aging monarch he had just deposed. Of course, what started as a seemingly straightforward nationalist coup would evolve into something much more complex and eventually much more autocratic over the decades of Gaddafi's rule. His Green Book ideology, his unique political system called Jamahiriya, state of the masses, and his increasingly eccentric international posture were all still in the future. But in 1969, it was about a group of young officers who saw an opportunity and seized it. The coup in Libya demonstrated once again how vulnerable established regimes could be to a determined military faction, especially when fueled by popular grievances and nationalist ideals. It also highlighted the immense strategic importance of oil and how control over this resource could become a major driver of political upheaval. Gaddafi and his cohort didn't just want power, they wanted control over Libya's black gold and the destiny it could shape. So King Idris went into exile in Egypt, and Libya embarked on a radically new path under its young, fervent leader. The 1969 coup was a watershed moment, not just for Libya, but for the entire region, signaling a new era of assertive, oil-rich Arab states ready to challenge the old order. It was a bold move, executed with precision, and it set the stage for one of the longest and most controversial rules in modern African history. Chapter 3. Ghana, 1966. When the Redeemer got redeemed forcefully. All right, let's hop over to West Africa to Ghana in 1966. Now, Ghana was a big deal. It was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence from colonial rule. Back in 1957, under the charismatic leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. Nkrumah was a giant of Pan-Africanism, a visionary, the Osajefo, the Redeemer. He had big dreams for Ghana and for Africa. But as with many big dreamers, sometimes the reality on the ground gets a bit complicated. By the mid-1960s, things in Ghana were a mixed bag. Nkrumah's government had invested heavily in infrastructure and education, which was great, but there were also growing economic problems, rising debt, falling cocoa prices. Ghana's main export, it's like their entire economy was based on chocolate, which sounds delicious but is fiscally tricky. Add to that, Nkrumah had declared Ghana a one-party state, and the Preventive Detention Act allowed for imprisonment without trial. So while he was a hero to many internationally, at home some were starting to feel the squeeze. The stage was set. On February 24th, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a peace mission to Vietnam and China, yes, trying to solve other people's problems while his own house was about to get a surprise renovation, the military and police decided it was time for a change of leadership. They called themselves the National Liberation Council, NLC, and they were led by Lieutenant General Joseph Arthur Ankara. It's always a bit awkward when you're trying to broker world peace and you get a call saying, Mr. President, about your job, don't rush back. The coup plotters cited economic mismanagement, corruption, and Nkrumah's increasingly authoritarian tendencies as their reasons for taking over. They argued that Nkrumah was leading Ghana down a dangerous path, becoming a dictator and cozying up too much with Eastern Bloc countries during the Cold War. It's like your friend who starts off cool, then gets really into one specific intense hobby, and suddenly alienates everyone. The NLC positioned themselves as saviors, liberating Ghana from tyranny. The coup itself was relatively swift. Soldiers took control of key installations in Accra, the capital. There was some resistance, particularly from Nkrumah's presidential guard, but it was overcome. The NLC announced over the radio that Nkrumah was dismissed, political prisoners were to be released, and Ghana was liberated. For many Ghanaians who had become disillusioned with Nkrumah's rule, this was welcome news. Statues of Nkrumah were toppled, a symbolic act if ever there was one. Nkrumah, stranded abroad, was obviously not pleased. He initially thought he could fly back and sort things out, but it quickly became clear that his rule was over. He ended up in exile in Guinea, hosted by his friend President Sékou Touré, who even made him honorary co-president. It's like getting fired, but your best friend immediately offers you a job at their admittedly much smaller company. From Guinea, Nkrumah continued to advocate for his vision of African unity, but he never returned to power in Ghana. The NLC, under General Ankara, promised a return to civilian rule and a clean-up of the country's finances. They received a fair bit of support from Western powers, who were wary of Nkrumah's socialist leanings and his alignment with the Soviet Union and China. It was the Cold War, after all, and every political shift was viewed through that lens. Is he with us or with them, was the multi-billion-dollar question. The coup in Ghana was a significant event because Nkrumah was such a prominent figure. His overthrow sent shockwaves across Africa. If a leader of his stature could be toppled, then no one was truly safe. It highlighted the fragility of these newly independent states and the powerful role the military could play, not just as defenders of the nation, but as kingmakers or kingbreakers, as it were. The NLC did eventually hand power back to a civilian government in 1969, but Ghana would experience several more coups and periods of military rule in the decades that followed. It seems once the military gets a taste for politics, it's hard to get them to just stick to parades and drills. The 1966 coup, however, remains a pivotal moment, marking the end of an era for Ghana and for Pan-Africanism. It's a complex legacy. Nkrumah did amazing things for Ghana's independence and for the African liberation struggle, but his later years in power were marred by policies that alienated some of his own people and provided the justification, at least in the eyes of the coup plotters, for his removal. It's a reminder that even redeemers can sometimes find themselves in need of being redeemed from power, though perhaps not quite in the way they envisioned. Chapter 4. Uganda, 1971. Enter Idi Amin, stage left, heavily armed. Now let's turn our attention to Uganda, 1971. This one gets dark, folks. We're talking about the rise of a man whose name became synonymous with brutality and erratic rule. Idi Amin Dada. Before he was the self-proclaimed conqueror of the British Empire and King of Scotland, yes, really, he was a commander in the Ugandan army, and the president at the time was Milton Obote. The relationship between Obote and Amin was initially quite close. Amin had risen through the ranks of the King's African Rifles and then the Ugandan army, and Obote had relied on him. But by the late 1960s, things were getting tense. Obote was centralizing power, pushing his move to the left socialist policies, and there were allegations of corruption involving high-ranking army officials, including Amin, particularly concerning gold and ivory smuggling from the Congo. It's like that awkward moment when you suspect your chief of security is also moonlighting as a very successful, very illegal international businessman. Obote was becoming increasingly wary of Amin's growing influence within the army and his popularity among certain ethnic groups. There were whispers that Obote was planning to arrest Amin. So while Obote was away attending a Commonwealth summit in Singapore in January 1971, seriously, what is it with leaders getting overthrown while they're out of the country? It's like a rule. Never leave your country unsupervised if you suspect your top general has leadership ambitions and a well-armed fan club. On January 25, 1971, Amin made his move. Troops loyal to him seized control of Entebbe International Airport, key installations in Kampala, the capital, and surrounded Obote's residence. Amin announced over Radio Uganda that the military had taken power, citing Obote's alleged corruption, tribalism, and the creation of a secret police force that terrorized the population. He claimed he was a reluctant soldier just stepping in to save the country. Many soldiers are reluctant when they seize power. It's part of the PR package. Initially, believe it or not, many Ugandans and even some international observers welcomed the coup. Obote's government had become unpopular with certain segments of the population, particularly the Baganda people whose kingdom Obote had abolished. Amin released political prisoners and there were celebrations in the streets. He was seen by some as a breath of fresh air, a simple soldier who would restore order and then step aside. Oh, how wrong they would be. It was like welcoming a charming fox into the henhouse because he promised to get rid of the weasels. Amin's initial promises were all about stability, ending corruption and economic improvement. He presented himself as a man of the people. However, it didn't take long for the true nature of his regime to emerge. What followed was 8 years of brutal dictatorship characterized by widespread human rights abuses, political repression, ethnic persecution, extrajudicial killings, and economic collapse. The reluctant soldier turned out to be a ruthless tyrant. One of his most infamous early acts was the expulsion of the Ugandan Asian community in 1972. Tens of thousands of people, many of whom were Ugandan citizens and formed the backbone of the country's commercial sector, were given 90 days to leave the country. Their businesses and properties were expropriated and handed over to Amin's cronies. This had a devastating impact on the Ugandan economy, which went into a nosedive from which it took decades to recover. It was economic self-sabotage on a grand scale. The coup that brought Idi Amin to power is a chilling example of how a military takeover, initially met with some degree of popular support or indifference, can lead to catastrophic consequences. It highlights the danger of unchecked military power and the cult of personality that can develop around a charismatic but deeply flawed leader. Amin's rule became a byword for state-sponsored terror and buffoonery on the international stage, though the buffoonery often masked a terrifying reality for Ugandans. The story of the 1971 Ugandan coup is a stark reminder that the road to hell can be paved with promises of liberation and reform. Amin's seizure of power wasn't just a political shift, it was the beginning of a national nightmare. The subsequent impact mentioned in the chapter title is an understatement of epic proportions. It plunged Uganda into an abyss of violence and fear. So, while Obote was in Singapore, probably discussing trade agreements or something equally mundane, his country was being irrevocably altered. The man he had once trusted, Idi Amin, was busy installing himself as the new master of Uganda, and the world would soon learn to its horror just what kind of master he would be. This wasn't just a change of guard, it was the unleashing of a monster. Chapter 5. Sudan, 1989. The coup that said democracy, not on our watch. All right, our final stop on this whirlwind tour of African coup takes us to Sudan in 1989. This one is particularly poignant because it overthrew a democratically elected government. Yeah, you heard that right. After years of turmoil and civil war, Sudan had managed to elect a civilian prime minister, Sadiq al-Mahdi. People were hopeful, thinking maybe, just maybe, things were heading in a more stable, democratic direction. Spoiler alert, the military had other ideas. Sudan in the late 1980s was facing a multitude of crises. The Second Sudanese Civil War between the North and South was raging, causing immense suffering and displacement. The economy was in shambles, there were food shortages, and the political landscape was fractured. Sadiq al-Mahdi's coalition government was struggling to cope with these monumental challenges. It's like trying to steer a ship through a hurricane while also dealing with a mutiny and a severe termite problem. It was tough. Enter Brigadier General Omar al-Bashir. On June 30th, 1989, he led a group of military officers, with strong backing from the National Islamic Front, NIF, a powerful Islamist political movement led by Hassan al-Turabi, to overthrow al-Mahdi's government. They called themselves the Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation. It sounds very grand, very heroic, doesn't it? National salvation. It's always a good selling point for a coup. The coup plotters gave the usual reasons. The civilian government's failure to end the civil war, economic collapse, corruption, and political infighting. They promised to restore order, bring peace, and implement Islamic Sharia law more strictly across the country. A key demand of the NIF. For them, democracy was messy, inefficient, and not delivering the results they wanted, particularly the kind of religiously oriented state the NIF envisioned. The takeover was swift. Military units seized key points in Khartoum, the capital. Prime Minister Sadiq al-Mahdi and other political leaders were arrested. The constitution was suspended, political parties were banned, and trade unions were dissolved. It was a clean sweep. Bashir announced that the military had stepped in to save the country from chaos and division. It's the classic "we had to destroy the village democracy to save it" argument. The international reaction was largely negative, especially from Western countries that had supported Sudan's democratic experiment. But within Sudan, the NIF and its supporters were of course, thrilled. They saw this as their opportunity to reshape Sudan according to their Islamist ideology, free from the compromises and complexities of multi-party democracy. Hassan al-Turabi, though not officially part of the military council, became the ideological architect of the new regime. What followed under Bashir was a significant intensification of the civil war, with the government pursuing a more hardline military approach, often framed in religious terms. Sharia law was imposed more rigorously, even in non-Muslim areas, which further fueled the conflict in the south. The regime became increasingly authoritarian, cracking down on dissent and human rights. The promise of national salvation began to look more like national subjugation for many. The 1989 coup in Sudan is a stark example of how military intervention, often justified by claims of restoring order or national unity, can lead to prolonged conflict and increased repression. It demonstrated the power of an ideologically driven faction within the military, allied with a determined political movement to derail a democratic process, however fragile that process might have been. This wasn't just about a few disgruntled generals, it was a calculated move to install a specific kind of a state. Omar al-Bashir would go on to rule Sudan for 3 decades, a reign marked by conflict, international isolation, including an indictment by the International Criminal Court for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Darfur, and eventually his own overthrow by another coup in 2019. It's like the circle of coup life sometimes. But the 1989 coup was the one that set Sudan on that particular tragic trajectory. It's a sobering reminder that democratic transitions are incredibly vulnerable, especially in countries facing deep-seated problems. And when the military, or a faction within it, decides that they have a better solution, or simply want power for themselves or their allies, the ballot box can be quickly replaced by the barrel of a gun. The promises made in the heat of a takeover often curdle into something far more bitter in the long run. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour through some of Africa's most impactful coups. From Egypt's revolutionary zeal to Libya's oil-fueled ambitions, Ghana's post-independence turmoil, Uganda's descent into darkness, and Sudan's democratic derailment, each story is a complex tapestry of hope, betrayal, and the raw pursuit of power. These aren't just historical footnotes. They are events that shaped the destinies of millions, creating ripples that are still felt today. It's clear that when the military decides to rewrite the political script, the consequences are profound and often unpredictable. Understanding these moments is crucial, not to glorify them, but to learn from them. They teach us about the fragility of institutions, the allure of authoritarian solutions in times of crisis, and the enduring human desire for change, even if that change comes through the barrel of a gun. The promises made by coup leaders are almost always grand: stability, prosperity, justice. But as we've seen, the road from a coup's declaration to its actual long-term outcome is often paved with a very different reality. It's a potent reminder to always read the fine print, especially when it's being delivered by someone in a uniform. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical insights. See you next time. We hope this journey through Africa's coup chronicles has given you a deeper appreciation for the continent's complex political history and the ongoing struggle for stable, just governance. It's a story that's far from over, and understanding its past is key to navigating its future. Stay curious, stay informed.